Workbenches are a necessity in every workshop, no matter how basic or complex. The Roubo Workbench is one of the most popular workbenches amongst woodworkers around the world, but not much has changed since its conception several hundred years ago. My goal in this video is to reinvent this classic bench, but nothing could prepare me for the level of detail that went into this piece. In fact, this is the most complicated thing I've ever made. More difficult than this, and this. What you're about to see is 2.5 months of meticulous work, which has resulted in possibly the most over-the-top workbench you've ever seen. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. This is a sentiment I agree with to a point. Why waste time and energy on something that doesn't need it? But this can sometimes lead us to overlook potential improvements. A common view with traditional workbenches is that they've been around for centuries, so their work-holding solutions are tried and true. And traditional joinery is still relevant today if you choose to use it, so why bother changing the features of a workbench? I feel like this confines our creativity to what's already available. It can limit imagination and slow down one's progress. I'm at a point in my career where I don't want to be hindered in any way. I want to get my ideas out immediately without any fuss, so I want this workbench to be packed full of every possible feature I can think of in order to work as efficiently as possible. So let's now figure out all the different features for the new workbench. So this is my current setup. It does have a tail vise, which I like, so let's add that to the list. It also has a leg style vise, which I like apart from the hardware, but let's add a leg vise to the list as well. Another thing that I dislike about this setup is the dogs. Now I have a single dog that goes into one of these holes depending on the length of the piece of wood, but these holes fill up with sawdust. So another thing I want to add to the list is pop-up dogs. Other clamping solutions I'm after is to be able to clamp flat panels without any interference to the face. The ability to clamp tapered legs. Now, I think a moxon vise will do this quite well, although I do think there'll be an issue with racking, but we can sort those issues out later. I also need to clamp unusual shaped pieces like you may have seen in my curved bench seat. These types of pieces are very difficult to clamp as there's no flat surfaces, a bunch of curves and different angles, so we'll have to figure out a solution for that. I'm also after a dedicated spot for measuring and marking tools, so I think a tool tray will suit me well for this bench. Another big feature for this bench is I want it to be on wheels so it can be easily maneuvered around the workshop. So I'm gonna have to come up with some hidden wheel solution within the base of the Roubo workbench. A few other things that I'm after is a pop-up plane stop, sliding dead man. I also want this workbench to look good, so I'm thinking of using some contrasting woods, some custom hardware, and some custom dovetails. Now, Roubo workbenches tend to come in full tops or split tops. Now, I like both of these, so I've got to figure out a way to try and incorporate both into this Roubo design. Okay, so that is the long list of features for this bench, so let's get into it. I've decided to build this bench out of hard maple. A big thank you to Britain Timbers for supplying the maple for this workbench. You can check out their website below for some quality information about different timber species. So I'm currently working on the bench top. This is where you're going to see the full top and the split top come together. You're also going to see the beginning of the vise that will clamp all those unusual shapes I'm after. The idea behind this vise has been inspired by a shoulder style vise, which is commonly used on Scandinavian style benches, but it has an extra feature that makes it incredibly versatile. This groove has a dovetail profile that will allow me to slide in different shaped plates that can be custom made to fit whatever piece I'm working on. I have somewhat of a universal plate at this point, which you'll see later on. Now, this style of vise has a lot of force that pushes away from the workpiece, and even though all these laminations are strong once glued together, the clamping force of this vise will separate the boards from one another over time. So I've added some threaded rod through the bench top that allows me to loosen and tighten the tension as the seasons change. It was surprising just how time consuming this part of the build was. The preparation for each one of these individual boards took a lot of time, as I wanted to ensure they were not only dead flat, but also I wanted to release as much of the tension in each board as possible. This step is incredibly important if you want to end up with a dead flat top once everything is done. Now, I feel like it's important for me to outline what to expect from this bench, as I've already had a bunch of comments on Instagram, as well as visitors to my shop during the build, say that this bench is too nice to use. You see, people have different theories on what a workbench should be used for and what it should look like. Many believe that a bench should be simple and shouldn't be elaborate or fancy. After all, it's a place to work, and I agree. But I believe a great workspace breeds great work. If you're proud of your shop, you'll create pieces that you're proud of. So let me just say right now, this workbench is going to be the Rolls-Royce of workbenches. Understandably, it may not be all that relatable. It's expensive and over the top with clamping solutions that may be redundant to some, but this bench is intended to be an exploration of ideas and a way to solve some of the issues I face when it comes to producing furniture. The reason for putting so much time and effort into this bench is because this is a representation of my work and the skills that I've developed over the years. And what better place to show off my skill set than on the very bench that will be used to create each piece from now on. You can see from this SketchUp file just how the bench top is going to work. The full top is on the left and the split top is on the right, and the split top allows me to extend part of the top beyond the rest of the bench, which will all make sense a little later. This SketchUp file is available for download over on my Patreon. I'll leave a link below. Now that we have the full top and split top done, it's time to move on to a detail that I've been wanting to try out for a very long time, which is one of the more indulgent features of this bench. Dovetails on a Roubo play a very important role, as once again the pushing pressure from the tail vise can separate the end cap from the rest of the top. So the dovetail needs to help lock this in place. The design of these dovetails are purely aesthetic, but I've always wanted to create these rounded dovetails. I'm not sure if there's a name for them, but I'm going to refer to them as shark's tails from now on. Another theory I have on shop furniture and workbenches is that this is a time for you to experiment and try different techniques. By no means are dovetails new to me, but creating them with templates certainly is. Plus, understanding the limitations of these shark's tails was interesting, as the radius of the curves are important in relation to the tools you own, as you're going to need a narrow enough chisel to get right into the sharp corners. Now, I mentioned earlier that nothing could prepare me for the level of detail that went into this piece, and I'm not just saying that for effective storytelling. This bench was 2.5 months of non-stop construction, which resulted in 25 hours of filmed footage, all shot in 4K, which totaled 3 terabytes. And trying to condense all of that information into a single YouTube video isn't easy. Unfortunately, I've had to cut a lot of processes and details out to make this video, but if you are interested in seeing each and every step of the construction of this bench, I've edited all the footage down into a detailed 3-hour, 12-part series over on Patreon, with no voiceover or music, just shop sounds. This will give you a much better idea of what's going on for the entirety of this build. Not to mention the fact that I have a separate 45-minute review video on the completed workbench where I discuss each and every feature in detail. Now, you may be wondering, how on earth could I spend all this time building, filming and editing this project when I have a business to run? Well, this is all thanks to these fine folks over on Patreon, who are allowing me to push my boundaries on pieces like this workbench. They've been following along for this entire build as I post update videos and quick tip videos from each and every piece I make, giving an inside look into my workshop. Incredibly, an extra 211 patrons have signed up since my last video, which is absolutely mind-blowing to me. I love the fact that I get to share my knowledge with each and every one of them in the hopes that they can push their woodworking to an even greater level. If you are interested in knowing more, I'll leave a bunch of links below that have previews of what to expect from Patreon. Now, just in case the shark tails weren't detailed enough, I decided to add a chamfer to all the edges. This is an interesting detail, and you might be thinking it's to cover up any gaps in the joinery, but in actual fact, it'll show mistakes even more. But I think it's a great looking detail that accentuates the shape of the shark's tails. Plus, you may notice later on that the chamfer detail gets carried around the entire top as well to help create a slight separation between the top and the end caps. It's interesting to think that the next time I work on dovetails, I'll be using this very bench that I'm currently building to make them. Throughout this entire build, I couldn't help but think of all the interesting things I'm going to make on this bench in the future, including this walnut desk, which will be the next video. Now, wait a minute, you might be asking yourself, how did you make that completed desk on a bench that isn't even finished yet? And this is where I could tell you that this bench was finished months ago, and I've been building on it ever since. But no, I'm not that well organized. This desk is just a model, and it'll be my next video. So be sure to subscribe if you want to see how I make the real thing. Now we're almost at the end of building the top as I'm about to attach the end caps. It's important to note that the end caps are only glued at one end of the bench top, and the remainder of the cap is fixed in place using some bolts with elongated holes. This will allow the top to expand and contract. Next, we're going to move on to the most complicated vise on this entire bench, the moxon vise, which does have some design issues that will need to be solved before moving on. Now, I mentioned earlier that I had some concerns about this moxon vise, and the reason for that is going to be because of the way I want to use it. Generally speaking, moxon vises are used by clamping boards in the center, in between the two screws. That way, you can get even clamping pressure from the top of the jaw to the bottom of the jaw. But the way I want to use this moxon vise is mostly going to be with angled legs that are pretty much the length of this vise, which means they're going to be sitting above the screw. And that presents an issue that is called racking. And this is not acceptable because it's providing uneven clamping pressure on the workpiece. It's not going to hold it securely enough, and it might also dent the workpiece as well. So I need to come up with a solution that's going to provide some even support on the underside of the moxon vise. And I think I have an idea, so I'll get into that next and see how we go. This vise has to be the most detailed and complicated vise of the entire bench, but it also has a bunch of different uses. Not only will it allow me to clamp angled legs, but it will also allow me to clamp wide flat panels without any interference to the surface like clamps or holdfasts. Now, as I said, there is an issue with racking due to the lack of support to the bottom of the jaw. So I'm going to add some brass round bar that fits inside of a brass round tube. This will supply enough support to stop the bottom of the jaw from moving freely under tension. Now, you may have seen earlier, before the bench top was glued together, that there were some grooves in the bench top. These are to house the screws from the moxon vise. Once again, all the footage of these extra details are over on my Patreon. Now, before we go any further, let me talk about the hardware. For every vise on this bench, I'm using bench-crafted hardware. They didn't sponsor this video, I paid for everything, and even though I tagged them in a bunch of photos on Instagram, I never heard anything from them, which tells me they're probably not a big fan of how I've customized their hardware, particularly when I made my own custom brass handles. You'll see more on that later. The hardware I've used for this moxon vise isn't the bench-crafted moxon vise. It's actually the bench-crafted high vise, which comes as a full kit, or like I did, you can purchase the screw only. I've used this because the screw is slightly longer and the hand wheel and screw move together, unlike the moxon kit where the screw is stationary and the hand wheel moves. Another issue with moxon vises is the jaw doesn't move with the handle wheel, which is kind of a pain. I've seen people use springs that fit over the screw to help move the jaw when unscrewing the vise, but I prefer this idea instead. I've drilled a hole through the screw and inserted a small brass pin. This pin rests against a custom brass washer, which all sits inside the vise jaw. Once the handle gets fitted to the screw, the jaw is now held in between the pin and the wheel, meaning it moves with the hand wheel. This is a small detail, but it will make using the moxon vise much more enjoyable. And don't worry, I'll show all the different vices and how they're used at the end of this video. With the moxon vise done, it's now time to give this giant top a base, which due to the split top and full top design, will take some careful design considerations to ensure this entire bench doesn't fall apart. Not to mention some veneer details that will help to lighten the overall look of this beast. I'm using mortise and tenon joinery for this base, as it's going to help provide the strength needed not only for the heavy bench top, but also for the side-to-side forces from planing and bashing away at material. I feel like woodworkers are naturally patient people. After all, it takes time to create beautiful things, and the process of each plane shaving and every tap of the mallet is an enjoyable one, where all the worries in the world just seem to fall away. I always like to refer to the wise words by John from Lincoln Street Woodworks, who says, "Patience is bitter, but its fruit is sweet." That's some truly wise words there, John.
Wait, I have never said that. Like, ever.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Alright, well screw that idea. Patience is overrated anyway. I mean, let's face it. The fantasy of every plane shave and mallet tap is a compelling one. And as much as I'd like to stroll into my workshop every morning and gaze at the wall of hand tools before meticulously setting up my hand plane and making that first shaving as it catches the morning light, just isn't possible for me at this point. I have a business to run, furniture to design, projects to build, videos to edit, photos to take, bills to pay, plus making mortise and tenons is boring. Not to mention the fact that I have 14 of these things to make. Ugh. That's why I've used power tools and templates to create these joints. Doing it this way is quick, repeatable, and accurate, and it leaves me more time to add in more creative elements like this. Now, the reason for adding in these carved leg details is to help lighten the look of the Roubo Workbench, which can tend to look a little bottom heavy as the base needs to be chunky to provide a solid foundation for the work area. And the reason for the veneer? Well, it's a design feature. And as I mentioned earlier, I wanted contrasting woods, and that burl veneer is really going to pop, especially once you see what I do to the leg vise. Now, even though I wasn't a big fan of the mortise and tenons, I did find these drawbores enjoyable. If you're unsure of what this is, basically placing a dowel through a joint stops the joint from ever coming apart. But with a drawbore, you slightly offset the hole on the tenon, which means once you bash the dowel through the joint, the offset hole in the tenon pulls the joint closed, like an inbuilt clamp. Like I said, the drawbores act as clamps to hold the joints together. The only reason why I'm using clamps here is to help square everything up before adding in the dowels. Now, the design of this base is very important when it comes to the bench top, as the full top and the split top require different setups. Each leg gets firmly attached to the outside edges of the worktop. The split top needs support in the center from a rail, and because there's a gap in between the two sides, this will allow for the top to expand and contract into the center of the bench. The full top, on the other hand, will expand and contract over its entire width. If we add a rail, like on the other side, then the full top won't be able to move freely, resulting in either a broken joint or a cracked top. But I have added some extra brackets to the legs. These aren't fixed to the top, so it can still move freely. And the idea behind this is to add a little extra support to stop the bench top from sagging. This is probably overkill, but I thought I'd just add it just in case. I've also added a bracket to the extended section of the split top, as it does hang over the leg quite a bit. Now, I hope I didn't ruin anyone's fantasy of what it is to be a woodworker. The reality is, woodworking is one of the most fun jobs you could ever do. I absolutely love it and wouldn't change my career for anything. And to be honest, if I won the lottery tomorrow, I would still be in my workshop building the most intricate pieces I could possibly think of. After 6 months in Italy, of course. It does take patience to be a good woodworker. After all, great things take time. I'd say I'm the most patiently impatient person you'll ever meet. I'm happy to meticulously obsess over intricate details, but have absolutely no patience for anything that gets in my way, like a faulty tool or the inability to clamp a piece properly. That's why this bench is going to massively help my productivity and general outlook on what I make from now on. And one of those things that's going to make my workflow easy from this point on is the custom-made pop-up dogs, which I can't wait to show you next. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that my current workbench is frustrating because the dog holes fill up with sawdust. So my solution to this is to have a bench dog in every dog hole. I've decided to go with square dogs as I like the idea of having a wide flat surface to clamp with. And even though it would have been much easier to create the square holes before gluing up the top, I wasn't entirely sure of the setup until this point. But this process wasn't too difficult. It's just a matter of drilling out the waste, then using a template and guide bearing with a plunge router. One of the main requirements though is I want the easiest access possible, so I'm going to add a pop-up mechanism to each bench dog. The common issue that I face as a professional furniture maker is the level at which I progress as a maker isn't on par with the evolution of my shop. What I mean by that is I'm continually building more and more difficult things, but my workbench and ways of processing material isn't handling the new techniques as efficiently as I would hope. The great thing about this bench is each and every clamp has multiple uses, and the bench top is going to evolve as I use it. I'm adding in the necessary dog holes right now, but I've kept the templates so I can add more in the future if necessary. Not to mention the fact that I can easily drill 3/4 inch holes for different clamps like holdfasts whenever I need them. Now, these bench dogs are incredibly easy to make, not to mention the fact that they're also cheap. I use offcuts from the bench's legs and I've simply just milled the material slightly smaller than the size of the dog hole, then matched the radius of the router cutter I used to create the dog holes. But where this dog truly shines is the mechanism. This is called a tip-on for doors mechanism by Bloom, and it's perfect for this application. And at the end of the day, making them this way has turned out much cheaper than buying pre-made pop-up dogs. Now, you may be thinking that this level of detail is excessive for a workbench. If that's the case, then you may want to close your eyes for the next part, because this is where things really begin to get over the top. This is a madrone burl. You've already seen me use it on the leg detail, but this is where it's really going to get shown off. Now, is adding veneer to your workbench overkill? Yes, but it's awesome. Plus, I'm going to be using a finishing technique to this burl shortly that is actually a practice run for an upcoming whiskey cabinet. In fact, if you like this piece, then you'll love the whiskey cabinet. This part of the bench is called the chop, and it's the moving jaw to the leg vise. I feel like this is where the workbench begins to turn into a fine piece of furniture. Not that I'd ever classify it as that. I obviously have high hopes that this bench will be the inspiration for many fine pieces of mine in the future. But if you want to see fine furniture right now, I'd suggest checking out the Australian furniture maker Darren Oates, who creates beautiful pieces for private commissions and gallery work. Not to mention the fact that he has one of my favourite woodworking channels on YouTube, where he delves into his processes on veneering, steam bending and vacuum pressing. I will admit his video pacing may be a little slower than what you're used to these days, but I can assure you he gives a valuable insight into the world of professional furniture making. I'll leave a link to his Instagram and YouTube channel below, and if you like his videos, be sure to subscribe to his YouTube channel. Hopefully that'll encourage him to make more YouTube videos, because let's face it, I want to see more. I'm almost positive that if I didn't get into furniture making, I would have become a luthier. I'm obsessed with guitar making and designs, and that's where the inspiration of this chop came from, as the design was inspired by the headstock from an Ibanez, which was one of the first electric guitars I ever owned. This staining technique is a common one used with guitar making. It's commonly known as popping the grain and utilises the random nature of the burl to create a beautiful ripple effect. I've also added a slight sunburst, which is another technique used on guitar finishes. I actually have a 25-minute video over on Patreon where I go into detail about this entire process. I'll leave a link below with a preview video of what to expect if you're interested. Now, once that clear coat goes on, you'll really see that burl come to life. One of the biggest issues with heavy workbenches is the ability to move them when necessary. This is way more important when you have a small shop, and I'm fortunate enough to have a big space, but I still want to move this bench out of the way for when I'm building large items. Now, you can buy fold down casters specifically for workbenches, but from what I've heard, they're not the best quality. Plus, I didn't spend all this time on making my workbench look as cool as possible to then add these ugly things to the outside. So I've come up with a solution that not only easily takes the weight of this 300 kilogram workbench, but also it's easy to engage, moves freely in any direction, and is completely hidden. These are 2 motorcycle lifts. Having both of them disperses the weight more evenly, and I'll leave a link to these below. I've had to customize them slightly, as well as add some better quality casters, but thanks to the carefully planned out rail that I assembled earlier, these lifts can bolt onto the base. Then it's just a matter of being able to access the screw mechanism that engages the lift. This is all going to happen with the socket handles that came with the lifts, plus a spare one that I have from another lift that I own, as well as some leftover brass I have from old jobs. I will admit quite a lot of effort went into this wheel system. It's a bit of a shame that all this hard work gets covered up with plywood, but the next section I'm going to work on contains a mechanism that can be shown off if I choose to, and to be honest, I'm quite proud with how this turned out. This is a gap stop, but could also be called a plane stop or tool rest depending on what you're using it for. And these are common with split top Roubo benches, although they are generally quite cumbersome to use, which in all honesty, if it's not easy, I won't use it. So I've come up with a solution to have a pop-up gap stop. Using some carefully designed plywood guides and a template, I'm able to position the guides onto the workbench and use the template to route out the same shape onto the gap stop. The plywood guides are designed to allow the gap stop to be fully removed, as well as have a low profile, because one of the main reasons for having the split top bench is so I can remove the gap stop and place my regular shop clamps down the center of the bench, and I don't want the guides to interfere with the clamps. Some of my favourite things about woodworking is all the intricate details, as well as figuring out solutions to problems such as the cumbersome gap stop and my solution to clamping unusual shape, which you'll see next. But this gap stop sliding mechanism is useless without something to help push it along. So I've used the same Bloom push catches I used on the bench dogs, except I've used the long version for this application. And I was actually quite impressed with how this all turned out. This part of the bench is probably my most favourite. The fact that the bench top extends past the rest of the bench provides a small work surface that allows 3 sides of access to smaller pieces I'm working on. Plus, the shoulder style vise is going to open up a world of possibilities, as I can now make custom clamping plates to suit whatever unusual piece I'm working on. This clamping plate is designed to clamp pieces that are curved in all different directions by creating an area that constantly allows 3 points of contact to the workpiece. Then, depending on the direction of the curvature, I can simply rotate the plate to suit. And because the bench top sticks out past the rest of the bench, I can spoke shave or carve the unusually shaped piece from 3 different sides without having to unclamp the piece and move it to a new position. Like the moxon vise, I've used the bench crafted high vise screw only hardware kit. Once again, you'll see all of these vices come together at the end of the video. Every feature on this bench has multiple purposes or uses, apart from this one, the sliding dead man. It's a weird name, but its purpose is to support the end of longer work pieces that are held in the leg vise, and it slides along a track depending on the length of the workpiece. Now, because it's a bit of a one-trick pony, and probably something I won't use all the time, I want it to be easily removable. I've been wanting to purchase a metal lathe for quite some time now, but just haven't gotten around to it. But it would have made this process a whole lot easier. I know I said earlier that I like solving solutions to problems, and trying to create brass handles without a metal lathe is a problem. But I think I figured out a solution. Now, this method doesn't provide the most accurate outcome, as each handle is a little different, but we can just say each one has its own personality. Once again, this is excessive work, and let's face it, custom hardware isn't going to improve the usability of this workbench, and it's certainly not going to help my work progress in the future. But if you've seen much of my work, you will know I love using brass accents to accentuate certain details, and this bench is intended to be a showcase of my work. You see, I use my workshop as a showroom for clients. As soon as they walk in, they can see that I'm organised and passionate about what I do, and this bench will show them the level of detail that they can expect in their own piece. Not to mention the fact that they'll know that their piece will be made on this very bench. A big shout out has to go to my buddy Leroy from Reading Furniture for his CNC work on this nameplate. I had a specific idea for this plate and Leroy really helped that come to life. I'm going to leave a link to his new website below. I suggest checking it out if you want to see a succinct and well laid out website. I'll also leave a link to his Instagram. I've got some highly figured English sycamore veneer that I'm going to be using for a future job and wanted to use some of it for this nameplate. The colour is identical to maple and the fiddleback adds in a new subtle element to the bench top. I've pressed the veneer onto some maple and had Leroy CNC my logo out using an 11-degree cutter so the lettering angles back slightly. I'm not usually one to place my logo in plain sight on a piece, but like I said, I had a specific idea that I wanted to test out. one that uses an existing element from the bench and incorporates it into my logo. Oil-based finishes tend to turn light-coloured woods amber, which isn't what I'm after for this maple. I want to keep its raw, natural colour. I'm going to achieve this by applying the first coat of oil with Fiddy's hard wax oil in white. Once dried, I apply 2 coats of the normal hard wax oil in a matte sheen. The white finish stops the maple from drastically changing colour. And it's now time to finally watch all the components come together. There's something inexplicable about turning an idea into reality. This bench started as just a thought many years ago, as a potential solution to help solve the issues I have when it comes to making furniture. And that idea is now a reality. But this piece resembles much more for me. Not only was this a bucket list item to build, but it also resembles a shift in my career. You see, this video is only my 20th build video here on YouTube, and thanks to the support of all of you, as well as all those on Patreon, I'm able to take on less client work and focus more time on creating videos like this. And even though I'm not entirely sure where this is going or what this means, one thing I can promise is that I will continually build the most challenging things I can think of and bring you along for the journey. By no means could I have ever imagined that this would take 2.5 months to complete, but the long process of meticulously crafting this bench has created a sense of joy within me that I didn't expect. I will admit that the first scratch on this bench will hurt a little, just like the first scratch on your new cast iron table saw or on your brand new car. But the reality is, this is a tool and it needs to be used, and I'm excited to see how it will evolve as I grow as a woodworker. Understandably, some of you will have the view that this is overkill, that it's just a place to work. But my sentiment is exactly that. This is a place to work. It's a place to be inspired. And what better way to be inspired than by the very bench you're using to create your next piece?